Welcome to our Future Proofing Trainers webinar. I'm Kerry Brox, the CEO of the Institute for Learning and Development Professionals. I have the great pleasure of catching up with Tony Ryan about every 6 months, and I find him a real fountain of knowledge about the latest technology and L&D trends. So I'm sure you're going to enjoy the next hour. I'll hand over to Tony. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Kerry. Oh, folks, good afternoon, wherever you are in the country. I hope you're having a fantastic time. Future-proofing trainers. Well, I'm going to run some slides here, and I will then talk to them, and we will set it up later on so that you will be able to download them anyway. Future-proofing of trainers. Well, here's my first point. It depends on how far ahead you would like to go. If we're talking 2 years or 20, it makes a significant difference in terms of what's going to be happening with training. I'd probably even start with this particular image here. And just in terms of changing the slides here, let me see. Laura, can you give me a hand here with this one?
Yeah.
How do I actually make that one move on?
This one here.
Okay, my apologies. You may have seen this one before. Over 100 years ago, the Times in London was talking about the issues that would be privy to London with the horse manure. Now, if in fact they had maintained the horses rather than the cars, they would have had some serious issues, but someone invented cars, and the same thing is going to happen with the training world. We absolutely don't know completely what's going to happen up ahead. Sometimes we can and sometimes we can't. So what I'm going to do through this session is talk about ways that you can predict the future. I'm going to talk about other ways that you can't work out possibly what's going to happen. And I'm going to throw in a few conjectures in terms of what's likely to happen in the training world as well. Can I make the point, though, that you will need to think differently? Things are absolutely going to be different up ahead. So basically, two perspectives on this. One is some options on the future of training, and then secondly, ways that you can future-proof yourself. I'm rather taken with the word future-proofing. Not everyone is enamored with it, but I think there is lots of merit to it. I often give sessions on how to future-proof kids and how to future-proof different organizations and different companies. It essentially means that you set up processes now so that you are more likely to be able to cope with whatever's up ahead. I was also going to download the session into my website at tonyryan.com.au. It will be up there later this afternoon, so if you do wish to access it from there as well, please go right ahead. Just go into tonyryan.com.au, click on resources, and go down to recent presentations, and you'll find that there is a full PDF. You are very welcome, by the way, to use these slides in any other session that you're going to give as well. Let's dive into this one. What's going on around the world today? Well, there are many different ways I could talk to that one. Here are a few blunt points that I believe are going to impact upon training worlds. It's very easy to quote statistics in terms of this, though around 90% of everything that has ever been created on this planet in terms of content has been developed in just the past 2 years. So we're talking since perhaps the Middle Ages, 90% in the past 2 years. If you've ever felt a bit swamped with what's happening in your life, this is partly why. The exponentialities in terms of this are astonishing. So by this time next year, in this single year from now till then, we will have created more material than has been developed in all of human history. It's simply overwhelming, so it's impossible to keep up with it all. I preface this by saying that those figures can be slightly misleading because a lot of it is based upon the measurement of video, which takes up a lot of space online. The second point there, a lot of things can't keep up with technological changes now, and anyone under 18 will tell you this. Politicians will talk about legislation taking years to enact. Even determining curriculum in terms of training can take a couple of years to receive support from every organisation, and by then the world has changed dramatically. So a lot of things are actually struggling to keep up. The issue of unemployment has always intrigued me in a very negative sense, especially with young kids leaving school. Australia is certainly doing better than other countries around the world, though the unemployment rate in the young people is still very unsettling. This is why training is so important, because we find that if they don't receive decent training and some sort of work in their first 5 or 6 years of their post-schooling career, they're setting patterns for life. So if we don't give training to them in those couple of years, we can actually find 30 years from now that there is a blip in the statistics on things like alcoholism and abuse and a whole lot of the more detailed issues in terms of life. One that really fascinates me with the world today is the way that the Gen Ys are choosing how to live their lives. To some degree, they're talking about living in 7-year cycles rather than just having the one occupation for life. I was in the States about 12 months ago, and I heard a guy called Ken Dishwald giving a talk, and he's a gerontologist. He studies aging. And he made the point that 2/3 of all the people who've lived throughout history on this planet, and that's about 90 billion people in total, 2/3 of all the ones who've lived past 65 are alive today. It is one of the greatest changes in human history in terms of the way that we do live our lives. Now, what's happening from that apparently is that the young ones are starting to trend differently with the way they live. So previously, if you're over 40, you possibly have lived a linear lifestyle, and the linear style is where you perhaps spent 5 years with a couple of parents who loved you if you were lucky. You went off to school for X period of time, perhaps 12 years. You perhaps went off and did some further study. And after that 4, 5, 6 years of study, you then went out and you found an occupation. And you worked in that for 40 years, getting very tired. And near the end, you just started to count your superannuation. And finally, you retired at 65. You lived for another 20 years in your retirement. Then you died for 10 years. And that tended to be the linear lifestyle. Now, a lot of the Gen Ys are looking at people in their 50s and 60s who are complaining about their work and their life and the fact they haven't got enough superannuation. And they're basically saying, do I want to be there when I'm that age? Not very likely. And so they are choosing to live it differently. So the 7-year cycle works something like this. They go through the normal period of growing up in terms of attending school and possibly university. I'll even talk about that in a minute. And then they start to live their first year, 7-year cycle. And in that 7-year cycle, they learn and earn and get trained for 6.5 years. And then for 6 months, they retire. And they go off and help some homeless shelter in Vietnam. They come back and then they live their second 7-year cycle. So for 6.5 of those years, they both learn and earn. And then for 6 months, they head off to the Amazon jungle and they help to resurrect some creature that's nearly extinct. And they keep doing that until they're 91. As I interview people who are under 30, they just tell me overwhelmingly they're not the least interested in doing something like buying a house. They're basically just waiting for their parents to die so they can inherit it from them. So they're just choosing to absolutely fully live their lives. Now, the implications for this are significant because it means they're going to be learning and training for life. And so we are going to need a lot of people who are giving support in terms of that. So keep in mind the 7-year cyclic life when it comes to working, especially with younger people. It's a very important consideration. In terms of future studies and applying it to a specific field, such as training, here's one perspective on it. We talk about the 3 Ps of futures. So possible futures are basically anything being possible. So in 20 years' time, there may be no training because no one has a job, because everyone has virtual devices or robots doing the work for you, so no one actually works. That's possible. It's very unlikely, but it's still possible. It's possible that we will need 3 times as many trainers as we have now within 5 years' time. Possible means anything is possible. Probable is more the left brain logical sequential. Probable is pretty likely to happen. So we can determine, for example, certain amounts of government funding up to a point will continue in different ways. We can determine that organisations will continue to want more with less. They are probabilities in terms of the future. Preferable future is my personal favourite, and a preferable future is where you say the way you want life to be up ahead in your organisation or your own life, you then backward map to now and you steadily put it into place. Now, you can't always apply a preferable future when governments are involved because sometimes we have no idea about funding, especially in the next couple of weeks. However, preferable is very important when it comes to younger people so that they feel they have the strength to develop futures themselves. So that's one way of looking at futures, where we talk about the 3 Ps. Here's another one. You've probably heard of the expression Web 1.0 and 2.0. Well, I sometimes talk about this within particular fields. So training 1.0 is probably something from the 1990s. And people who perhaps have not moved on very much would continue to do this sort of thing. So they would have very didactic instruction, front and center, sage on the stage, simply, organizing things from front and center. If they did use technology, it's only to slightly reinforce on the training. So they may take a video of what they're doing so that people can refer to it later on. Training 2.0 is probably where most really switched on organisations are right now. Strongly interactive, constant feedback from students in terms of how effectively the training has been augmented. Probably having just-in-time training as well, so that rather than just doing some course every 6 months and hoping that people remember it 4 months later when they need those skill sets, they can actually connect in with that training exactly when they need it. You can also basically deliver it anywhere and anytime, so it's 24/7. That's training 2.0. Training 3.0 is probably 1 or 2% of organisations right now in the training field. It's probably going to be much more commonplace in 5 years' time through to the next 20. Strongly one-on-one, personalised delivery of learning so that we can measure where someone's at and then we can provide it just for them. Often using a lot of wearable technology. Now, Google Glasses is coming through later this year. The third or fourth iteration of that will be very interesting and will have big implications for training. Having very strong immersive experiential applications so people can be anywhere, anytime on the planet, and they can actually visit it in a teleportation type way. Maybe even having more and more virtual employment, so we're going to have to rethink what it means for someone to be gainfully occupied. There is no doubt that we are going to be replacing some lower manual skills eventually with robotics. Training 4.0 is where I probably have a bit of fun and I start to lose people. Transformational 4.0 would be around 2035, 2040. We will have more and more of what we see BCIs, brain-computer interfaces, where your brain can in fact connect with different technologies. The iPhone 25 will probably be a brain implant and your thinking will simply transfer messages to someone else. At that point, all bets are off in terms of how training is delivered. However, rather than me just playing games and conjecturing on that for the rest of this time here, I'll stay more on, say, the training 2.0 and 3.0. Here's another way of looking at futures and how to predict what's going to happen. We talk about scenario planning. Scenarios are possibilities and what is up ahead. So we might come up with 4 or 5 or 6 scenarios, and there are many ways of doing that. We then determine the indicators that will tell you that they're going to be happening somewhere in the near future. And when you see those indicators, you then make sure you're more prepared for them when they're about to come through. Well, here are some scenarios, for the next 2 to 5 years in terms of training. Scenario 1 is basically where everyone continues to want more with less. And as I read about this around the world, I find in Singapore, the States, and the UK, organisations are asking for shorter training times, yet they're demanding that just as much is managing to be done in that time. Another scenario, scenario 2, is where we have very rapid changes, and that's probably the 7-year cycle I was talking about before, and that's going to need a massive further injection into training provision because things will be changing so dramatically and rapidly that we will need to skill up our workforce. Scenario 3 is probably getting into my 3.0 or even 4.0. It's where we may not even need any training by 2035 or 40 because most work is being done by robots. Personally, I don't think it's going to happen because it means then the people won't have any taxes to pay, which means that they can't fund governments with their services anyway, and I'm sure that at some point people are going to start rethinking something like that. Scenario 4 is a pretty likely one, and it's where we see a very strong overhaul on how training is absolutely done. And we start to focus more in on possibilities with global networks, so we simply find the best trainer for a particular skill at any time. We see more and more blended learning, as in between real life and online, and we even engage more in virtual worlds when we're taking part in that training. So they are some possible scenarios. So that's another option in terms of how to look at what's up ahead. Now, this one's a little more colloquial and blunt and direct, and yet it's one of the most effective ways of predicting the future. It's basically when I ask people to rate what they believe it's going to be up ahead. Now, it's sometimes referred to as a Delphi technique. So if I could ask 90 of you right now to put in your rating, and then we worked out the average between all of those numbers, we would have a reasonable indication of where training will go over the next 10 years. So for example, if we on average had a 2.4, then basically we are in licorice all sorts. We are in a lot of trouble because it means that you wouldn't have good faith in that future, therefore you'd be less likely to make something worthwhile happen with it. Conversely, if the average was 9.5, then the training environment is probably going to be a very inspiring one, with lots of very switched on people doing some amazing things to get the best possible, processes going. I could even apply this with your own life as well. If I asked you for a 1 to 10, same scenario again. It's called the self-fulfilling prophecy or the Pygmalion effect. Now, certainly there are other factors that will influence what happens in training and in your own life, though certainly with your own life, significantly, your attitude is going to make a difference to it as well. So that's another way of looking at how to predict the future. Can I make an upfront point here and pretty well say that I've had it fully. I've had enough of people who try and paint the worst with the future. Any science fiction movie will make it look as horrendous as possible, and increasingly I see some aspects in mass media who are trying to portray the worst possible with the world up ahead. Conversely, I reckon there's a 98% chance the world is going to be great up ahead. It will certainly have its ups and downsides. The world's always been a beautiful mess. It always has been, and it always will be. In between all of that, though, there are an amazing number of great people who are trying to do their best and make great things happen on the planet. 3 books I have read recently would indicate this very strongly. If you have the time, spend 2 minutes going into the site for the book called Abundance, and you will find 2 scientists there who are outlining what they believe could be done within the next 8 years on this planet. We could have clean drinking water for every person on the planet. We could have a primary school education for every girl on the planet, which, by the way, is one of the single most effective ways of creating a viable quality of life for every person on this planet. Because when you give a primary school education to girls, you find that 10 years later the entire country where you did that has a decreased incidence of AIDS, they have a decreased incidence of abuse in families, and all sorts of other indicators that show that it's a better place in which to live. Abundance is basically saying the world's going to be abundant up ahead. The Rational Optimist was written by a guy who went back through the media of the last 50 years and found that where anything was going on that looked as though potentially it could have been difficult was often beaten up in the media, such as the Y2K bug. Now, I can remember back to when it was sounding as though the world was just about going to come to an end on that New Year's Eve in 2000, and yet very little happened. He has talked about this, making the point that all of these things are built up all the time, and as a result we have this collective belief that things potentially are going to be horrendous. Conversely, they're not. And that comes to this 3rd book called The Progress Paradox. And this guy finds that the better things get, the worse people think they are. And that's the paradox. So even though standard of living, at least in the Western world, continues to improve, and that can be measured quite accurately, people are more and more convinced that things are getting worse all the time, partly because of the material from that 2nd book, where they're always told that things are going to be awful. Now, the dilemma there, if you have a training organization, is that some companies will go, well, it's going to be horrendous up ahead. Business is going to be worse and worse all the time, and we don't have the money to do any training. And this is why it's so important for them to have a reasonably optimistic perspective on the future, because then they feel as though there is something to work for. So it's worth having quality training with employees with great skills who can make the most of whatever happens up ahead in that wonderful world. So just a thought in terms of where the world will be in a few years' time. Some probable training futures. Well, here are some different things that I believe, are pretty probable, and they're already starting to happen right now. We sometimes refer to it as rapid personalization. It means that we can pinpoint with each person in a training situation one-on-one. So Bill Gates, for example, is working on lots of computer games that can be played by people, and after a couple of hours, we can then measure quite accurately their capacities and understandings on different things, and then we can then pinpoint just what they can and can't do and apply skills accordingly. So generally it's called rapid personalization, and I think it's got huge implications for training generally. I briefly mentioned just-in-time training before, and that probably will come through more and more as well. I worked with one police force in Australia last year, and they're about to issue iPads to all of the police in their particular state. And the idea with that is that if they're rushing in pairs to a domestic disturbance, they can simply play the 2-minute video right at that time to update them on just what to do when they get to the door. Whereas if they have to troll back through their memory to 2 months previously where they did the training for that day, it's not as effective in terms of their application. Just-in-time training is very powerful. More and more we're seeing what we call continuous career readiness, and again that fits in with the 7-year cycle. So it means that people are going to have to keep updating all the time. It's now a cliche when people say that school leavers are going to have 4 to 10 to 15 different occupations in their life. So everyone knows that, but continuous career readiness is where training is going to become so important up ahead. We are also seeing some altered forms of accreditation as well. Big questions being asked about 4 and 6 year degrees, and I'll come to that in a minute. Learning analytics is again with those computer games where we can measure how well someone can do something and then take it further with them. Learning analytics is going to become very big in education in general. So when we talk about accreditation, I was reading this last year about the death of degrees. Perhaps not, though at least half of the universities in the States will probably need to close down by 2025, so this will certainly come into it. This is why MOOCs are going to become more prevalent. Having the online delivery and then setting it up so that people can engage in dialogue continuously with other small groups all the time. Open badges are one example of this mini credentialing. Open badges are where you could in fact receive accreditation for 3 hours of reading you do between midnight and 3 a.m. because the computer on your screen, your webcam, can actually measure that you are doing the reading with your movement of your eyes. It also has the face identification, so it knows it's absolutely you, and then it also records any comments you make on your screen in response to what you're reading. Previously, you couldn't authenticate that you'd done work like that, but now we are more likely to be able to. So we're going to have to start rethinking what it means to credential people. I'm finding that more and more university leavers are questioning aspects of their degrees. So when someone does a 6-year engineering degree, their lecturers tell them that half of what they've just learned in that 6 years is obsolete. And these 23-year-olds are saying, well, why did I spend 3 of the years doing that? And the lecturers respond rightly so that they didn't know which part would be obsolete. However, they're asking big questions about a whole 3 years being spent on something that, in fact, won't be able to be put into place. So we're now looking more and more at the online and in situation training when you're doing something rather than sitting in a lecture hall for the entire period of time. The just-in-time training, as I've mentioned briefly, the iPad videos, in-situ feedback received from, say, a mentor in your workplace, having immediate access to anything online. I'm finding the app world is delivering specifically on that as well, so we can have the just-in-time training as much as possible. This is not to say that the formal training is going to go out of fashion, but instead this is going to augment it. It's going to add to the quality of it every time. Learning analytics is done in a couple of ways. In the bottom right-hand corner of the screens there, you've got user and inferred student data. User interaction data is directly what people are doing, so you know what sites they went to, what they wrote. Inferred data is where it does make inferences on where someone's thinking in terms of what they're doing as compared to just registering where they want directly. Learning analytics is massive. Colleges now more and more in the States are using what they call big data, or this learning analytics, to predict who is going to do well in different courses because of the cost of keeping someone there even for a single year. The fancy expression is predictive analytics. You may have colloquially heard of what is called big data. It's essentially where we can now number crunch to the most astonishing degree to determine different things. And this is going to become all pervasive in our lives. We can now predict 8 days before you contract the flu with a 90% certainty whether you're going to get it or not. As long as you use social media and you tend to put in certain keywords like I'm sick, and you have GPS on your devices, we know just where you've been and who you were with, and they were going to say they were going to get the flu, you're more likely to. I could show you how to predict a small share movement on the stock market with an 85% certainty because of Twitter, just by simply looking at the algorithm of them and the word that keeps coming through, because if people are positive about something, they're more likely to buy things. Predictive analytics will be a huge industry when it comes to training, because we'll be able to ascertain how well someone will be able to do something and whether perhaps they need to do something else as well. Different ways of delivering on training. Uni of Wollongong has a process called IC, as in I-SEE. Now, this is a virtual world that does have me interested, and I've run a couple of mini courses with it. So instead of you just setting up your virtual avatar to move around and then going back and doing your texting and your emailing while you're just pretending to stand there taking part in the course, your webcam shows your face in real time. So you can then move your TV screen around when you're walking it somewhere. Now, as the trainer, facilitator, lecturer, I can then change the size of the room. I can ask 4 people to move off into another room outside, and when they do that, their voice starts to fade away. They can then come back and they can report on what they actually did. It's a very interesting technology. You also have things like these, lots of different telepresence options. This device costs around $15,000. I haven't seen any in Australia yet, but they're already available in the States. You could be sitting in your office with your webcam on and your face comes up in real time on the screen, and with your keyboard you can then move the little motor in this device so you can move around the room. So it gives you just a different telepresence in terms of delivering on different things. I could see situations where bigger companies, the Coles Myer and the BHPs, purchase quite a number of these, and then they contract trainers to deliver on the training for them in the telepresence world, rather than having to pay the airfares and accommodation and a whole lot of other things to get someone in. So we'll see more and more of the telepresence options too. We're going to see more and more of the use of the wearable technology when it comes to training. So with Google Glasses, essentially anyone could be anywhere and they could deliver on the training. Now, some people get a little bit overblown about this, and they carry on about the amazing things you could do with these. Now, the only difference with them really is that you can put them on your face and use your hands for something else. I could hold up my phone and do pretty well the same thing this thing does now. And in fact, I can see situations in the near future where someone will be wearing these and walking down the street, and you'll see them running into a lamppost somewhere because they're so focused on what's on their little screen. All that notwithstanding, the possibilities on the delivery of learning are very interesting. So I noticed that last year, a physics teacher in the States was allowed to go into the Hadron Collider in Switzerland. Now, if you're a bit of a techno or a scientist, you will know that that is a pretty fancy little piece of gear. Very few people are allowed in. But Google arranged for this guy to wear these Google glasses inside, so he cruised in, he rode around on a bicycle in the 22.5-kilometer circuit, and thousands of students back in the US were able to watch everything he was doing. They heard every conversation he was having, so he was interviewing different people, and they heard everything that he basically said. So you see, when it comes to training, there are no more barriers in terms of where it could be and who's actually doing it. We're getting to the stage where we all have what I believe is called a neurological age, a brain age, if you want to be blunt about it. You might be able to see that little device that that lady is wearing on her head. It comes from a company in New York called Emotiv, E-M-O-T-I-V. It costs around $250. There are no wires attached. She simply has that on her head. She has another little attachment on her iPad or a laptop if she's using it, and by thinking, she can change what is on her screen. Now, it's not as though it can read her mind. She might, for example, have to think strongly of the color orange, and that might take her into a particular application that she needs to have opened. All that notwithstanding, I'm staying very close to being able to order one of these, because I want to be the first trainer in Australia who can stand in front of a group of people and just wear one of these things, and simply by thinking, I will change what is on the screen behind me. I reckon if I can do that, I'll be a legend forever. No one would ever get over the memory of that one. Point being, it gets very exciting when it comes to all the applications and possibilities. Just imagine you being able to organize things just by using your brain like that. One of the biggest implications, I believe, for a lot of lower skills training are what we call 3D printers. Now, most people have heard of 3D printers. It's worth having a look at what are called 4D printers as well. It offers a fourth dimension where something can be printed out on a 3D printer, but over a period of time, it can be programmed so that it can change in shape and size to some degree. We are also about to see the world's first 3D printer copy machine. So that means I could put a device into this 3D printer fax in Sydney, and I could actually send, it could be scanned, I then send it through to someone in London where it gets printed out for them at the other end. Now, when it comes to manufacturing as an industry, it is under threat in the most significant way, because within 10 years, there is nothing that cannot be made with a 3D printer. We are talking cars and houses. At the moment, we're just in playland. It's Disneyland with the basic things people are making, except they're moving on them so rapidly that they are going to completely revamp what it means to have manufacturing. That means we then have to completely rethink what we're training people for. There is no sense in doing training for industries that no longer exist. And one of the reasons organizations are going to go with 3D printers is that it's eventually much cheaper to manufacture something. And then we take into account the delivery of those things that are made. You know, Google and Amazon might talk about the way they're going to have drones delivering things through the air, except you might be able to deliver things just by having them printed out in front of you. In fact, if your car breaks down in your garage in 5 years' time, you'll be able to download the part from Ford or Renault or whoever, and it could print out in your 3D printer. So you just pay for the template that allowed that to be printed. In fact, big money will be made by companies who have the IP that is downloaded by others. So if you want to get in early on that one, start thinking about the sort of things people in their houses would want to download consistently. 3D printers are going to be massive. So what are you going to do about all of this? Well, it's a massive piece of string to even begin to talk about that. So here are a few different options. In terms of coping with all of this, with future-proofing yourself, for a start, use 2014 thinking to start to resolve any issues you have. I am heartbroken by the organizations I go into who I believe are still using 1980s thinking to solve 2014 issues. So for example, way back 30 years ago when someone needed to get some extra program written, they just spent another couple of weekends on it. These days, you don't have the time anymore. There are already 28 hours each day. It's not possible to fit anything more in. The unfortunate thing is that people continue to do so. So as a result, they lose more and more of their personal time, and it's just eaten up by their professional time. We need to think differently, such as, for example, with crowdsourcing. Now, crowdsourcing is essentially where you can source the crowd to do something. You can go into almost anything in a social media realm, and you can find someone else who has already done what you were probably about to do. Very few things are totally original. So as long as you pay respect to IP, or you pay someone for it, or you negotiate with them, just about anything can be found from someone else. We are truly reworking the wheel on this planet today, so we need to think differently when it comes to resolving our new issues. Now, part of that is with what I call the wardrobe principle. I think we're trying to do too much sometimes, and there are strong cases for focusing in more with laser beams as compared to the bright light that's trying to cover everything when it comes to having an organization. The wardrobe principle works like this. In my wardrobe at home, I have a certain number of shirts. In fact, it's 20. If I go and buy a new shirt, an old one has to go. So St. Vinny's does really well out of me. So if I buy a new one, I have to think to myself, one has got to go, so I better make sure I know which one it's going to be. I don't just put another one in there. The thing is, though, I think more and more organizations are doing this where they don't think about throwing an old shirt out. They keep them all there. So more and more programs are running concurrently all the time. As a result, people are exhausted trying to cover all bases doing them all, and they have less time to do each one. Better to do a few things well than a lot of things badly. Another thing that I believe we need to do with all these changes is to keep focusing on solution whenever we can. Now, I'm married to a psychologist, and it's always fascinating having your resident psychoanalyst at home. And she tells me that to some degree we all fit on a continuum. At one end we complain about things and say the world's going to be awful up ahead and business is going to be horrendous and no one's got any money anymore to do anything with it. At the other end you've got people who are more optimistic and they're into solutions, so they simply look for what can be done. They're often very realistic people. Now, we need to focus as much as possible on solution. In fact, it's called solution-focused therapy. The next time you're having an issue in life, start thinking, what can I do about it, rather than bemoaning the fact it is happening to you. And here's a very important one in terms of upcoming changes. Back at the start, I mentioned that 90% of everything that's been created on this planet has been developed in the past 2 years. It's obviously impossible to keep up with all of that. And so the concept of being an expert is undergoing a revolution. It's now no longer possible to know everything about any particular topic. It's very difficult to even know just part of it. You couldn't even know 1% of most topics on the planet. An expert these days is someone who knows where to find things out rather than just knows it offhand. That's the expertise. Now, part of the expertise is being able to curate the information. Just in case you haven't heard of the word before in this context, curation is significant when it comes to taking on new knowledge. If a museum curator needs to set up a new display, she or he might have 1,000 artifacts and need to choose just 20 to put on display. They look for the best possible display out of what they've got. Now, when it comes to knowledge, we need to curate what it is that we most need to know. Otherwise, we just get swamped and we're drinking out of a fire hydrant rather than a normal cup. So we have to learn how to curate. So I can see more and more trainers becoming training curators or learning curators in the years ahead. And it's where you work with an organization to show them what they do and don't need to know, and also how to access information when they can as easily as possible. So let me see, when it comes to the solution approaches, sometimes I just set things up like this. I'll talk about problems on one side and then solutions on the other. So some people go, well, I just can't keep up with new technologies, and I'll just go and have another drink. And I say to them, well, why don't you find a coach, maybe a 14-year-old, work on your peer network, or in fact learn how to curate properly. And so on it goes down through these. Now, when it's one like the students know more than me, well, I meet a lot of senior teachers and trainers of, post-schooling students, and they go, well, they know more than me when it comes to the technology. And I basically say, well, you need to GOIMO, which GOIMO stands for get over it, move on, because it's just how the world works now. You have to do things like work out the way you can utilize their skills when you're doing your training, rather than feeling threatened because they simply know more than you. And even saying this tech stuff isn't for me. Now, the only solution I can point out there is to, please have a really big rethink because it's not going away anywhere. I often train people around the world in terms of thinking and coming up with new ideas. And I sometimes talk about processes like this. I've developed different things called innovation keys and then thinkers keys. So we probably start with purpose and just go, why are we doing this? And then we do our research, that's the background information. And then we work out the core question we need to address. And then we brainstorm ideas to that question. And then we come up with some decisions from those brainstormed ideas. We might pick one and then we work out how to put it into action. I believe everyone needs good processes like those to actually get things organized. And in fact, we could go further with that and build up more and more inquiry when it actually fits in terms of training. So that's a slight variation on that one that I just mentioned there. And we get through to how can we apply, share and apply our training. The second last one that says how will we do further useful research is critical with curation. I'm finding that too many adults, let alone teenagers, seem to think that research is spelled G-O-O-G-L-E, and it is not that simple. 90% of stuff on Google is unmitigated rubbish anyway, so it's important you understand how to curate it, how to synthesize through it and work out what is true and what is not. So having inquiry being built into training can be sensational as well. Further, in terms of the future-proofing, building up what is called training capacity. One direction I have seen in some organizations is to not always involve outside trainers, but to try and build up the capacity of their own employees to deliver on the training. Now, this cannot be taken to the nth degree because you will always need outside authority and expert to give you support, but there is definitely a movement with this. So this is where employees end up facilitating more of the training. Now, I do keynotes all over the world, and I have no end of work, though on occasion, me giving a keynote has been supplanted by someone who's simply an everyday person who's doing their work in their organization, and on Skype, they might give a presentation to 2,000 people in the States, rather than having the so-called expert. And I think this is wonderful anyway. That's part of making use of employees. It's where we work out how to sustain learning. Now, anyone who's serious about training knows how important this is. It's more than just obviously just providing the training. It's learning how to sustain it over a period of time. And things like building up inquiry and that are really important for that. Building up training capacity can also focus in on the development of your own conferences. More and more organizations seem to be doing this as well and making them very cutting edge. Sometimes they even run TEDx events. You can run a TEDx event in your lounge room at home as long as you fulfill their criteria. That's worth looking at as well. And yet again, they build in just-in-time training, so it's immediate, it's applicable, it can be accessed right when people need it. So that's one way of looking at that. And then even in more detail, I would ask about people's own learning network. So yours specifically, let alone anyone you ever work with. Almost without exception, when I offer any session, I positively challenge people in terms of their own learning network. Now, it's called different things in different countries around the world and in different parts of Australia. It basically means you know categorically how you maintain your own learning and training through your life. And there are two obvious ways of looking at it. One is real life and the other is online. So the real life is making regular connection with people you know are very switched on, or actually being coached by someone, or heading off to some really specialist dialogue discussions, Online, of course, is using social media. Please be careful about denigrating all social media. It's like everything else on this planet. There is good and bad enclosed. There is a lot of wonderful worth to social media as long as you follow the right people. Well, setting up decent online readers and having apps that can perhaps do this. And when it comes to online readers, this is the most wonderful way of keeping up to speed on different things. My favorite on my iPad is Flipboard, just in case you don't have it. It's free. It's my favorite online reader. Now, years ago when someone wanted to do research on something, they would go into all of their bookmarks on their laptop and they would search through to those thousands of bookmarks until they found just what they needed. These days, we set up something like Flipboard. We then go and we set into place the different things we want to follow, such as with mine, it could be obvious things like Flip Photos and Flip Style and Flip Music, and I've got about 20 on mine. When I open it up at any time, it then immediately accesses the very latest from each one of those areas. And you can go searching and find a whole lot of different fields. It could be people who are brilliant at different things, who are keeping one of their Flipboard blogs going, in a sense. It could be the general stuff like Twitter and your Facebook. It is absolutely worth spending 5 minutes doing this. I even run training sometimes where I will have people in the audience using this immediately, and as we start each session after that during the day, a couple of people in the room are asked to give feedback on the very latest thing they've found on some screen somewhere. You can't possibly keep up with it yourself, so you tap into the audience to actually do something like that. There are many other ways of doing the online readers. Feedly is one that can be loaded for free up onto a desktop, but you could use things like Pinterest or BlogLovin is where you can find some of the best blogs on the planet, or Dig. There are thousands of others. Even Facebook and Twitter can be used to good effect in terms of this. Twitter would provide half of my professional learning. I just make sure I follow people who are going to tell me the latest information on something rather than telling me what they're having for dinner somewhere. I'm not interested, but I am in terms of their learning, and that's where it becomes important. You see, all of this comes down to something like this. We can talk all the great theories on the planet in terms of learning and training, though there is one fascinating new one that has really got me intrigued. Now, behaviorism has been around for a long time. Personally, I'm not a fan. The carrot and stick. If you do this, we'll give you that particular result in a test. Constructivism is fantastic. You set up a learning experience and they construct understandings as they go through it. Instructivism is still valid. If it's necessary, you do directly instruct as long as you can substantiate it's the most effective way of doing the training. Cognitivism is one of my favorites because I'm right into the thinking stuff. So this is where we show people how to think as effectively as possible so that they can think on their feet and they can self-regulate when they're taking actions out in the real world. Now those other ones have been around for quite a while and they pretty well have stood the test of time. However, they all happen inside the brain. Increasingly, we're finding that this latest theory is becoming more relevant, and it comes from a guy called George Siemens in Canada. And I heard George Siemens talking in Vancouver a few years ago at a big conference, and he was talking about his theory called connectivism. If you go into connectivism.ca, you will find an outline on this. According to George Siemens, connectivism is not just what you know, it's who you know when it comes to training and taking on new learnings. So your ability to know where to find something out is as important as actually knowing it. So these days, you can just take your phone out of your pocket. You can pretty well find anything you need. You can do the Siri thing. So that means that trainers now have to go to a higher realm. Instead of just talking knowledge and core skill development, they need to show people how to access that information more effectively. Because in 3 years' time, what you're doing today may be irrelevant. But what will be relevant is the trainee's ability to actually then reframe it according to what's happening up ahead somewhere. The practical example of connectivism is Apple's Genius Bar. Anywhere in the world that you go into an Apple store, you will find a Genius Bar at the back. I've been into the one in New York, in Rome, in San Francisco, in Beijing, in Hong Kong, in London. I go wherever I can just to see what's going on with it. Now, at a metaphorical level, this is massive for an organization. With the Genius Bar, if you own an Apple product, you sign up on their website for free to get 20 minutes with a Genius. And they're usually about 18 or 20 years old. I have seen some much more chronologically gifted ones there as well. And you then go up and say, oh, look, how do I embed this into that when I need to do that? And this Genius goes, well, there you go. So you do this and this and this. What else would you like to know? And I love this concept. And I think that the Genius Bar could be applied more in organisations to tap into the expertise there of people who are working there every day. In fact, we need some sort of yellow pages of all the employees in an organisation so that if at all possible, you know who to connect with instantly to find out what you need to know. It is a way of saving time with everyone. It's a matter of just simply sharing with each other with the time all the time. Connectivism, I'd like to know how it's used in your organisation, how you build it into your training, how you use the technology to do it, how you get people to talk in real life so that by the end of a training session they've set up forum groups so that they will get together and they will support each other afterwards. Connectivism is a significant learning theory. That also fits in with some of the supports coming up online in terms of simply getting work done, and these also have massive implications for employment. Most people have heard of Freelancer and Odesk. I've recently become quite enamored of Fiverr, as in double R, and it's essentially saying what would you do for a Fiverr, or what could you get done for a Fiverr. I recommend just spending 5 minutes going through this site and having a look at what can be done. So in the last month or so I've been challenging myself with it to see what could be done for a Fiverr. Now in the bottom right of the screen I have got examples there of 2 book covers that I've had designed for books that I'm writing at the moment. So I'm writing a book called Innovation Keys, and it will have all these processes for teaching adults how to become as innovative as possible. That cover design there was done for $5. The one on the left is a book on the future that I'm going to write. It may not be called that. I'm thinking of calling it Keeping Up with the Future. However, that also was designed for $5 by this young guy in the Philippines. Now, everyone wants a bargain, so I'm thinking, hey, this is just really fantastic. I only had to spend $5 getting each of those done. What happens to the graphic designer in Australia, a young lady who's 19 years old, who I paid maybe $900 to a year ago for doing the similar sort of work? Massive questions here. Point being, I can now connect with anyone on the planet in terms of getting different work done. So what happens with young people coming through who need work in different ways? We are definitely going to see a levelling out of different structures on this planet. So someone in Morocco is going to end up being paid similar amounts to someone in the States or Australia. I cannot see any other way of that happening. So there's another implication for different things coming up. I believe generally we're doing a massive movement in the training world and education world from what some people call knowledge consumption to knowledge creation or even co-creation. So here's the short version of this one. Knowledge consumption is where you sit and you consume. So it could be with me raving at you right now. It could be you sitting in a lecture form somewhere. It could be watching a TED video. It's essentially where you're consuming knowledge. And that's fair enough and fine up to a point, taking into account, of course, that at the moment it's impossible to consume all of it. Increasingly, I believe systems are moving towards knowledge creation, and it's where we're showing people how to create the new knowledge themselves. To me, that is the higher realm of capacity. So rather than just accepting it and just processing it in your head, you know how to reframe it and then come up with something new. This is the innovation, and it's coming through strongly with apps. So when I see people who are sometimes 12 years old developing those apps, I clearly see knowledge co-creation coming through and more. I believe they are the value-added people you'll see in organizations, the ones who can absolutely create new information as compared to just consume it from others. You also will see something like Kickstarter and the hundreds of other crowdfunding sites where you can make things happen. If you're short of $50,000 for a new program that you'd like to put into place, it's worth having a look at some different forms of crowdfunding. Now, Kickstarter is the best known and will give you a clear, sense of how it works, but you could try something like Indiegogo, INDIEGOGO. That also will help you out with this. They are just amazing when it comes to generating money from other people. I've put a few dollars in at different times just to see what happens, and I've ended up with cheap apps as a result of it. So that's just another version of the Genius Bar where people are tapping into others, but this time for funding itself. If you needed some sort of framework in terms of how technologies are used in terms of training, Apple have what they call their SAMR model, going from the bottom to the top. And it's essentially saying that if you're using technology in the delivery of instruction, it's going to be at one of these 4 levels. So I'm going to just gloss over this, but I assure you it's worth seriously thinking where, in fact, you are in terms of this. Now, the bottom 2 are what we call enhancement. to some degree they add to the way you've been doing training. Substitution is the lowest level of all. It's where you might just have a tool substitute in some way. Augmentation does improve the learning, such as using infographics rather than text. The top two are the very exciting ones. We call them transformational, and it's where they truly reframe what it means to do amazing training. Modification is where we do things we could not have done 5 years ago, because we can now get trainees to make videos for teaching other people around the world. And that, of course, is a higher form of learning in itself. Redefinition is usually astonishing. This is where we use Google Glasses, where we have people co-creating in terms of projects all over the world. This is often done by people in YouTube when they're developing a music app together or just a music video, and 20 of them will actually put in parts each without ever meeting each other. The SAMR model is definitely worth a look if you're analyzing how to use technology in terms of what you do. However, given that I've just said that, can I also make this point? It's not necessarily about how well you're using the technology. It's actually about the quality of the training itself. If I had a choice between a wonderful trainer who had no technology compared to someone who had millions of dollars worth of technology in the room but was a poor trainer, I would take the former every single time. It's always about the quality of the training. That comes first. However, if you can combine the training with great technology, then you are going to be delivering on amazing training. So given that, I'll also make this point. I don't think trainers are going to be replaced for quite a while. Well, a decade. Though after that, all bets are off. I have no idea after that in terms of what could happen with robotics. However, technology won't replace trainers, but the first ones to go in any organization will be the ones who actually don't use technology. I am not trying to do a scare tactic on anyone there. I'm telling it like it is. Increasingly, the number of people who come to training are the younger generation who are well-versed predominantly in the use of the technology. And if they have someone there who stands and lectures at them all day, they simply won't accept it. So you will have to take on the technology. There is no other choice about that. And you'll do generally what is called blended learning. There are other expressions for this, though I don't mind the concept of blended learning. And they often talk about different models within this. So you'll have access to these slides anyway, but you'll notice that at the top left you have what is called face-to-face. So it's where a teacher is still with the students, though they will use technology well in particular rooms they're in. Whereas on the bottom right we have online drivers, where in fact they'll never meet. They will only connect remotely, and also the students will work with each other remotely. And then you have the variants in between. So blended learning is definitely becoming more and more important. So as I'm drawing this together, here are 4 questions that you could possibly do in terms of this. So hopefully I can walk my own talk. The first 2 questions are almost very similar, except for one difference. The first one is basically, what could I do with this? Now, you could do everything with it or nothing. Or maybe you'll decide on 3 that most appeal to you. Or maybe you'll decide to share the slides with someone else within 24 hours. You know, you could make up a whole list of things of what you could do. Could is maybe. The next question, though, is will. That means you absolutely will. You will be struck down by lightning from above if you don't do it. So we're talking you will do it. So you take what you listed in the could, and then you cut it down to what you will do. And you just work out the how and whens. You know, what day, who with, what will it cost, what will I need to do, what's the first step, what's the second. And then basically, how will you sustain it? So if you've chosen something here and you decide to put it into place, how are you going to keep it going? Most people are well-meaning and will start things off, but it's another matter to keep it going. So work out how you're going to actually sustain it. So as I'm finishing off here, if you would like to follow me in any form, I'm in Twitter at Aussie Tony. I tend to throw in anything there that is funny or different or is a cool quote or the latest video in terms of great learning. I focus on education in general. So if you want to follow there, you're very welcome. If you'd love to have your brain spread quite a bit, you could get into Facebook, where I have a site called Powerful Futures, and that's where I do push limits. That's where I'm referring to post-human states, where people will be transplanting their entities in and downloading them into some sort of artificial devices they're about to die. So if you'd like to really be pushed with limits there, please go for that. My final slide, I began with this one, I will finish with it. The one prediction I can make is that the training world will categorically be different up ahead. Some things will be retained that are the same, they will be great, and they will be maintained, except a lot of other things are going to be very different. So you'll need to think differently as well. Can I thank you very much for your time here? And in terms of time, we have...
I've got about 5 minutes to do some
5
questions.
minutes? Okay.
Just this 1 second, 1 moment.
So Laura is now going to jump out of one part here. And we'll have a quick look at those questions if we can.
This one's to come down 1 moment. There we go. Further questions here.
And we're nearly there. So,
There we go.
okay, let me see. Ah, yes, lots of lovely simple questions that I can give a glib quick fix answer to. Online webinar training courses. To better run online webinar programs. Offhand, I can't think of one. I do that sort of material, and I'm sure ILP does. I am actually running one at the conference in August, so if you'd like to come along to that, I'll make it totally pragmatic with very realistic ones as well. Okay, it'll be a masterclass facilitating e-learning workshop. Yes, how do we get around the issue of our clients wanting to stick with the tried and tested methods of training because they're risk averse? I wish I had a quick fix to that one as well. The KISS principle comes into this, keep it short and simple, but what also comes into it is actually giving support to people to take on new things as much as possible. What do we call it? It's where you explain something to someone so that they can see the benefit to it. I often, for example, work with parents of children who are taught in schools, and teachers are trying to move the parents on. So here's one argument I use for that as we're starting to finish off here. How many other professions would you go to where you accepted them being stuck in the dark ages? So for example, would you go to a doctor who clearly said that she or he had not kept up with medication and the developments in the past 40 years? Would you go to a dentist who used a drill from the 1970s? Would you go to an accountant who had no idea about taxation law in the past 15 years? There are very few people say yes, I would go to someone like that. And I gently turn it back on people in their own profession and make the point that no one's going to come to you if you don't keep up to speed on different things too. At the same time, we can hold on to things from the old. There are some things that never change, and that's important to remind people of as well. Some things will always stay the same. Some of the ancient wisdoms and the belief in each other and supporting different people. So those sorts of things will stay the same too. And there's just a quick response to that one. The name of the device the woman was using, it comes from a company called Emotiv, E-M-O-T-I-V. Look that one up and you will see all of the different devices they've got. That could take you there. Let me see. I think that's probably as much as I can offer right now. I can't offhand think of some perfect course that you could go to right now, but as I said, at the conference in August, I will absolutely give more ideas in terms of that. So, anything else, Kerry, that you'd like to wrap up on?
Sorry to barge in before. I just wanted to add that at the conference, the day before is one of our pre-conference workshops. We're actually running an accredited masterclass on facilitating e-learning and webinars. So I'll just give that a plug, as well as being able to see Tony the next day at the conference. He's one of our key speakers. So that's happening on the 1st of August at the beautiful Kingscliff Resort. So thanks very much, Tony, for your time today. It was very enlightening and amazing what's in store in the future. So I'll hand back to you just to wrap up.
Okay, thanks, Kerry. Well, that's all from me. I hope the rest of your day is just amazing, and I look forward to seeing you in August. Thank you very much.